member of the European Parliament representing the Netherlands, where she focused on trade, foreign affairs, and of course, technology policies. To discuss the book, we also have two excellent discussants. Professor Esther Keymolen, so I'm going to present them in the order of appearance. Professor of Digital Technology and Regulation with a focus on ethics and philosophy. Esther is also the head of department at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society. So welcome, Esther. And Paul de Hert. I don't think I need to introduce Paul. He's the soul and founder of CPDP, so yeah. Thanks for joining the book club. I will give the floor now to Marietje Schaake, the author, and you have around 10 to 12 minutes, and then we're going to follow with a discussion.
Great, thank you so much. This is a beautiful room, but it's also, I think, tricky that it's so comfortable that after lunch you might just kind of, So what we will try to do in the panel is to keep you at the edge of your seat and hope that it will be a very interactive session so that you won't snooze and we won't have to worry whether everyone is okay. But thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. Lots of connections of different phases of life, and it's a real pleasure to be back here at CPDP, which has grown a lot since the last time I was here as a member of the European Parliament, so it must have been over 6 years ago. So I want to tell you just a few snippets from the tech coup, which when it first came out led to a number of questions where people asked me, you're using the word coup. Are you not exaggerating? Are you sure that what is happening is really an illegitimate power grab? And fast forward to where we are today, a bit more than 6 months after the book's release, people ask me, does the word coup still capture what is actually happening if we look at the power of tech companies and how they are attacking, eroding, and harming democracy? So the context within which this book is read and discussed has dramatically changed since I was able to put the last words on paper. And a lot of the ways in which democracy is at stake in relation to the outsized power of technology companies is not as visible as Elon Musk, that is given responsibility over the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or is not as visible as the CEOs of Amazon or Google or Meta lining the front rows of the inauguration of the US president, really tying their fates and the reputations of their companies to this, whatever you may think of him, and I can guess here in Europe, but whatever you may think of him, to a very controversial president who is also anti-European and really hurting the rules-based international order, allowing companies to inform key domestic policies and foreign policies. So for a lot of people, what the tech coup represents can now be seen in the news headlines on a daily basis. And I say this, of course, with a heavy heart. This is not something I'm happy with. But if there's anything that you take away from this brief introduction of the tech coup, I would like you to look at the problem of the outsized power of tech companies as a systemic problem that is not always visible. And I want to just very briefly highlight 4 ways of thinking about the invisible ways in which tech companies assert more and more power and how that can be in friction, tension, confrontation with the rule of law and all the principles that that represents. And then I'm sure we can talk about solutions, more geopolitical developments, concerns about what is not in the book or what could have been better in the book. I'm very excited to have a lively discussion. So thinking about the less visible ways in which tech companies are taking more and more powerful roles in our world, one way is just to zoom in on what changes the existence of new innovations, the release onto the markets, what changes that can cause. So I've spent years of my life, unfortunately, on the phenomenon of spyware. And when you think about it, the fact that there are now technologies that allow for zero-click attacks on victims or targets that can enter into people's devices without the target having to make a quote-unquote mistake of opening an infected link or attachment, changes a lot of fundamental notions of the right to privacy, but also source protection of journalists, for example. And this can happen because a company decides to sell on the commercial market intelligence-grade technologies. So anyone who can afford it can buy an intelligence service right now. That's pretty shocking, and it puts a lot of pressure on the role of governments and fundamental rights in the case of privacy and press freedom, just to name a couple of examples. But we can also think about facial recognition systems. AI applications such as facial recognition tools are out there on the market, but we know that they often discriminate, do not recognize various skin colors in the same success rate. And even if at one point maybe the success rate will be completely even, then of course all of our privacy rights are violated equally. So the de facto power that companies have by just releasing this technology onto the market is one way to think about the power of tech companies. Another way to think about it is their market power. And I think this is a room of people who don't have to be convinced about what that market power looks like, but I still think it's helpful to illustrate it from time to time. So let's take Microsoft. Look at its market cap, which, you know, every US tech company has seen some ups and downs, but by and large, this still stands. If we take that market cap and plot it against the GDP of countries, we will find Microsoft somewhere between the size of the economy of France or Italy. And I think that sort of illustrates what our collective dependence means for their position. Capital that can buy talent, data, microchips, lobbying power, sponsoring of events, academic research, civil society organizations, and also the way in which we think about technology, the framing of the debate. So the market cap of tech companies is, I think, another obvious way in which they assert power, which can really be in friction with the role of states. I was recently talking to a diplomat who said, you know, there's another component that you should really be aware of. As states, and this was not a small state, we struggle to have diplomats representing us at all these different tables around the world, at the UN, at the EU, at the ITU, at other standard-setting organizations. We simply don't have the people, the capacity to well prepare our diplomats to be represented there. But of course, you've guessed it correctly, this is not a problem for these very well-resourced tech companies. And so, as a result, and as a result also of a big belief in this so-called multi-stakeholder model, tech companies have a significant seat at the table of discussions about rules and norms, and that's another sort of stream of power that they are able to assert. Now, quickly two more and then I'll stop. The behavior of tech companies is often quite intransparent and sometimes deceptive in relation to lawmakers and democratic representatives, for example. The standoff between Elon Musk and the Brazilian judge made that very clear. The idea that a CEO could just say, I don't care what the rule of law says, I'm going to leverage my companies and push back and back and back. But we also see it in the process of applying for licenses for data centers, renewable energy. Oftentimes, tech companies are bidding for data centers, land, electricity, water, without revealing their true identity, and without, sometimes, transparency around the use of electricity and water, because it's actually at the discretion of the companies themselves. Some companies report, some don't, and there are no standardized metrics for reporting, and so it's really hard to know what is actually going to happen in terms of the use of resources at a time where the power grids are already at code red, according to the utility companies. We face more and more drought, and still there are more and more data centers that are going to come online. There's a huge appetite for energy, land, and water use, and I foresee major clashes with local communities, with the public interest, and I think the notion of data centers and how the whole process of applying for licenses sits within democratic societies is actually an under-told story, because it is just so fundamental, but we can come back to that. Last example I want to use as an illustration of the outsized power of tech companies is really in the more geopolitical domain. We now see tech companies across the entire tech stack that basically have products and services in all layers, and as a result they're building critical infrastructure, scanning it for risk, securing it, but finding themselves at the heart of a number of geopolitically tense dimensions in, for example, the undersea data cable domain, where security warnings in the reporting every year are pointing out how fragile they are, how much of a target for geopolitical conflict. But think also about our enormous dependency on satellite constellations such as those of Elon Musk's Starlink, his own reading of whether or not the people on Crimea, in Ukraine, should have access to these services, the presentation of something like a peace plan that might as well have been written by the Kremlin. We see more and more that through the use of technologies that find themselves in key nodes of our geopolitical tensions and dynamics, CEOs are beginning to play more of a role of their own. And of course, coming back to where I started, the fact that there's now such a merger between tech companies and the state and political interest in the United States really exacerbates the potential for companies dictating what foreign policy looks like without the proper international legal standards, without accountability mechanisms, or without clarity on who's responsible for what. And by that I mean anything from protecting undersea data cables to cleaning up debris in near-Earth orbit. There are so many dimensions here that really touch upon the public interest on human rights, democracy, the rule of law, also in the international domain, that this is another area where companies are the new sovereigns and states are being pushed aside. Now, there's more to talk about, but we're going to do that together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marietje, for this very... it's too short, huh? The introduction, because it doesn't do justice to an excellent book. So I'm going to start with praise, because this is truly a great read. It's thoroughly researched, clearly written, and it's kind of striking in a holistic perspective. Even for an audience like CPDP, full of people who know their stuff when it comes to privacy, democracy, tech governance, this book still manages to add something quite unique. And for me, what makes it stand out is this, well, I have to say, a rare combination of first-hand political experience and sharp analytic insight that Marietje brings to the table. She really takes us, as a reader, she takes us behind the scenes, beyond these important yet still quite abstract concepts, into these concrete political, institutional, and even personal dynamics. So where the decisions are being made, contested, or quietly derailed. So Marietje is not only an insider, she's also an excellent scholar. So she connects these experiences to rigorous analysis. And so her observations are contextualized and theorized, and they open up really a broader political and normative room for new questions. And so for me as a reader, what really triggered me was that we, in academia, because I'm from academia, we often treat these big ideas like law, democracy, security, technology, as if these are kind of natural forces or immovable systems. But what I think the Coup really shows is that these structures are made by people. They don't operate on autopilot, although sometimes we think so. They are constantly negotiated, defended, eroded, reinvented by human actors. Some with good intentions, some with self-interest, but they're all shaping what we are now experiencing. And for some, this might be unsettling, especially when it comes to lobbying, influence, asymmetries of power, something that is the book also rightfully warning us about. But for me, there's also a note of hope in that perspective, because it again makes me realize that a change is possible. So the system is something that we together can build and create. So I highly recommend the book. And as we already heard in Marietje's introduction, it's rich and it's complex, and I will definitely not pretend to do justice to it in 10 minutes. But what I want to do now is I'd like to share with you and with the audience how I approach the book. So reading it, and not only as an concerned European citizen, but also in my capacity as a professor of philosophy of digital technology and regulation. So triggered by Marietje's sharp analysis and provocative ideas, I try to kind of tracing a set of connections, looking for patterns, trying to kind of get a deeper structure of what this book is doing for me and what it is telling us about the world we are in. And I found myself like kind of digging, not like a mole, blindly tunneling through the text, but guided by a concept that's maybe not explicit, an explicit topic in the book, but to me it does stand out, namely the fundamental role of boundaries. So I'm very curious later on how you think about boundaries, but let me first take a moment to unpack what I mean by that before I return to the book. So for me, a boundary is not a simple fact. It's not something we can always see or measure or calculate. A boundary is made. It is drawn, it's a judgment, and that makes it contestable, right? So they're not internal, they can shift, dissolve, be reinforced. They are never just technical, never just neutral. You might say that the simplest definition of a boundary is the point where one thing ends and another begins. But then again, where exactly is that point? Who decides, on what grounds? So to draw a boundary is to make something happen. It determines what is in and what is out. On the schoolyard, a chalk line, A versus team B, right? So you're on that side, you're on the other side. Huizinga, a Dutch philosopher, has the idea of the magic circle. Gamers in this audience might know that term. Already from 1938, the space where special rules apply, a space set apart from the rest of the world. And Huizinga is not just talking about board games, he is talking also about warfare, also about laws. So this playfulness is constantly part of what we as human beings are doing. And this game can only exist within certain boundaries. Okay, so you kind of get the point. Drawing a line means making a claim. Who belongs, who decides, on what grounds. They involve activity. You could say boundary traffic, which is one of the fundamental features of life itself, whether it's photosynthesis, predator-prey relationship, breathing air, everything happens, life happens in the traffic across boundaries. So let me sum up. Boundaries are not given, they are made, they're dynamic, normative, and they activate all kinds of systems. And once you start seeing them, these boundaries, you see them everywhere. So that's what happened to me when I read the book. Suddenly, it became a book about boundaries and how in our current time frame they are challenged in so many ways and on so many different scales. Boundaries between online and offline, cyber and physical, public and private, capitalism and democracy. So, and through that lens, I want to offer a few reflections and also pick your brain and ask a few questions also to the audience, which I know is very well-informed and smart. So the idea of boundaries actually already appears right from the very first chapter, I would say, where Marietje unpacks the kind of foundational myth of the tech world, this utopian belief that through technology and the internet in particular, we can transcend these boundaries of the nation state, of geography, even of time itself. That was a dream of the early developers, cyber libertarians, a boundless digital sphere liberated from the constraints of physical space, territorial jurisdiction, political oversight, globalization in its most radical form. Not just economically, but really also ontologically, like how do we live without boundaries? A world in which everyone could be connected to everyone, everywhere, all the time. The end of history. So it was more, I would say, you also very well described that, it's not just a technical vision, it's really an ideology. So from the famous mantra of move fast and break things, replace the notion of move slow and safeguard rights and values. So breaking boundaries, legal, political, spatial, was seen as a form of progress, a path to a better world, and governments for a long time gave this ideology free rein. To be clear, I also think, and we must acknowledge that this boundary-less digital vision did also bring a lot. Enormous innovation, entrepreneurial energy, social transformation, but the fundamental idea that there was no longer an outside, there was no longer the need for friction or restraint, this end of history idea was quickly proven to be a fantasy. We know the Cambridge Analytica, NSA, etc., etc. So soon we enter this new phase, what Marietje describes, and I would say it's a kind of renegotiation of boundaries. So the old division between online and offline, there is no longer a clear inside and outside, and I think this dynamic becomes visible in the third chapter, when you write about the weaponization of everything. You see that these offline-online spheres become to merge, and that in the process of this boundary renegotiation, the rule of law states are often, they emerge as the weaker party. So traditionally, we see how national security is a core responsibility of the state, that it increasingly becomes determined by private actors. And they're on the front lines, you could say, of these boundaries, these cyber boundaries. They often have more insight than governments into what is probing these boundaries, and with what intent. You suggest that we need more transparency and more structured information sharing from these private firms that are able to attribute actions and identify these actors and provide that information back to the state, who holds the ultimate responsibility for our security. So I think that from a boundary perspective, if I take my lens, I would say that there's this rise of a very intriguing configuration. Private actors as the de facto border guards, while sovereignty and final accountability must remain within public institutions. And then you see there is this kind of tricky balance, right, to maintain, and especially given the way in which these tech companies operate. And that I would like to then take you to chapter 7, which is on sovereignty. And for me, that's the climax of the book's boundary narrative. Sovereignty is, at its core, about setting and maintaining your own boundaries. And the EU has traditionally asserted in its sovereignty through its regulatory power, defining the terms of entry. That is, the technologies from outside the boundaries are filtered through a framework, through our boundaries, a framework of democratic values and fundamental rights. And this is a form of boundary setting that allows external technologies, once sufficiently aligned with our principles, to be treated as ours, our technologies. But as Marietje shows, in today's shifting geopolitical landscape, allies are no longer behaving like allies, and where boundaries are constantly redrawn. Rulemaking alone is not going to cut it. Sovereignty today is not only about controlling about what comes in, but also, I would say, about forcefully denying access and building the capacity to be more independent of the outside world by developing all new EU-based technologies. And this is, of course, at the moment, high on the agenda in politics. So this leads me, finally, to pressing questions for me that arise when I view the book and our broader current state of the world. So what I'm worried about is, or my question is, many of the EU's landmark tech laws that have been crafted were developed during a time where the free market, international cooperation, transatlantic alliances were relatively uncontested. We had this idea of who were in our boundaries, who are together with us, and we would be outside the boundaries. So in the current climate, are we even capable politically and economically of holding on to those laws and the values and principles they represent, while at the same time building our own technological capacities? Or do we risk, because of all the pressure that we feel, that we confuse means with ends, so that we make the mistake, possibly, that when the EU has a success in the tech race, that this will be the success of democracy itself, or not? So are we putting this on the same level? And can we do that? So, and if we are serious about defending these values, and I sincerely hope that we are, should we then not also have a more open and democratic conversation, especially with citizens, actually, about the price that we are willing to pay? So what kind of technologies are we not going to let in? You already also in your discussion refer to the danger of these high-risk technologies, about facial recognition, commercial spyware, and I fully agree. But if we want to protect the public sphere, does that not also mean we must rethink the acceptance that we now have of the more mundane, everyday applications? Also in your book, you refer to the threats application of Facebook that was for quite some time. It wasn't allowed in the EU because it was not compliant. Now it's here. What do we actually miss if we would keep some of these technologies out of our boundaries? So what do we stand for or what do we stand to lose as a community if such platforms are absent? So finally, for me, there is this lingering question, also occasionally present in the book, that with the right checks and balances, we won't have to choose. I still have this feeling that we tend to think that we can have it both still. Sovereignty and global interoperability, privacy and still seamless convenience, control, democratic control, and dependence on private infrastructure. Aren't we at risk of falling into kind of the same trap as the utopian ideas of the thinkers that shaped the early days of the internet? Full innovation and full protection, now not by leaving cyberspace alone, but as old-fashioned, weary giants of flesh and steel. I quote the Declaration of Independence of cyberspace, gaining back control. So I would love to believe that, but perhaps the conversation we now need is about the hard choices. We can no longer avoid that there are things that come at too high of a price, and that we might need to think about what we want to leave or have to keep outside of the boundaries if we take our democratic and European values at heart. You're welcome.
Yeah, but Esther asked the question, no?
Should I?
Yeah, if you prefer to do it like this, yes. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for your very well considered response. There are always trade-offs in policy discussions, but I think what's less scrutinized than what might need to be changed is what the status quo means for our freedoms, for our national security, for our competitiveness in the world. I remember well that when I was a member of European Parliament, you know, the lobby for what was the right direction would usually start when a new legislative proposal was on the table. But one of the sort of other through lines that you could read in my book is that I'm showing really how the status quo has gradually evolved into a point of threat to democracy. And it's sometimes hard to pinpoint one moment or one incident. But if you compare the big tech companies of the years when Barack Obama was campaigning and using data analytics for the first time to engage citizens, to what these companies have become today, well, we're not scrutinizing with the same kind of ambition for the protection of digital rights, for the protection of our sovereignty, for the protection of our competitiveness, how this gradually evolving status quo challenges us. And so I'm sure there will be trade-offs. I'm sure there will be a price, particularly will be asked by the tech companies in the United States quite literally. I mean, we are hearing Meta these days saying if we feel treated unfairly by the European Union, we will run to the White House. If you give us a fine for violating antitrust rules, there has to be a price that the EU has to pay. And of course, this price will probably be on machinery or pharmaceuticals. But that price, quote unquote, is one that we pay now for the lack of action for the past, I don't know, 2 decades or so. And so you could say that we've kind of taken a mortgage until now, and now we have to pay what we haven't sort of invested in over the past decades. So that's one sort of response, and I think it was also in your reflections, are we capable of building alternatives while preserving our values? And this is a question that I get in almost every meeting that I have these days, whether it's about the book or related topics. And I would love to see, and I also think that this is something that we as humans have to create, so I would love to see much more self-confidence in us Europeans. Because the defeatism of saying we're probably not capable anymore, there are no alternatives for Microsoft, is precisely one of the problems. It's a barrier, not a boundary, but it's a barrier. This attitude is a barrier. Part of what distinguishes Silicon Valley from Europe is attitude. It's not just the ecosystem of investors and startups and great universities, but it's really also this idea, if we believe in it, we're going to do it. And I would also say, let us evaluate whether we've been capable after we've tried. But we cannot conclude that something hasn't worked before we've tried. And so this is sort of a rallying cry to us all. Yes, we can definitely create a much better status quo in Europe that does a better job at strengthening our sovereignty, incorporates the way we build and regulate technology in the mirror image of democratic and public values. And I think that could actually be a unique position in the world of technology. I don't think we need to have equally big and equally data-hungry companies in order to be some kind of match to what we see elsewhere. So, yeah, this is, I guess, just a plea for continuing to challenge the status quo and to feel agency as people, because that's where you started. Where we are has been created by a variety of choices. We are now at a big moment of potential change that could lead to a different set of choices that can have a decisive impact, and so we must also use this momentum. Because moments like this don't come along every day, thankfully we could also say, but we must use it, because if we don't use it now, then indeed it will be harder, next year, the year from now, the 5 years from now. And then indeed we may end up in a position where we have to conclude that there are no other options. But I think we can and must do it now.
Yeah, I didn't want to be in this panel because I value my internal balance, and I get so much energy from my colleague here, Marietje, that I shouldn't have drunk that double espresso. So, and then the other thing that is not good for my espresso stomach is that you were so many, and you are, some of here are young and interested and open, others are older and meaner and have. So in 5 minutes I will give the floor to them, okay? But I did read the book, and and yeah, well, okay. I decided to withdraw from the world, and I read Thomas Mann and authors that are dead, yeah, and that's my life world. But now I'm in contemporary politics. They told me a couple of days ago that we had a new pope, and that was new. Now, what I would do is recommend this book for many scholars, because usually you have books that build up with a strong diagnose and then are blurry on the solutions. Yeah? This book isn't. It's speaking to all of us, whether we're in law, policy making, or other areas. And I found the chapter on solutions really strong. Yeah? Full with unexpected ideas. So you make an appeal to imagination and creativity and vision, and it is there. So there's a solution that is proposed as applying the precautionary principle. And then you would say, some of us, oh yeah, I've heard that before. But you're actually weaponizing it against the risk principle that our EU is liking so much in an interesting way. It's not against, but I've heard too much about the risk approach, and I would recommend reading Marietje on this. So, but it's just an example. Then there are, and this is a plea that I follow, there's a lot we can prohibit simply, doing like in a cowboy and Indian in a Western way. There are things we should not have. Deep fakes is not for data protection, it's for criminal law, and people who do that should end up in a prison or something. So there's a easy coercive mechanisms for what is morally evil. Yeah, but in this technocratic language of data protection, we have lost sight of that, and this risk approach language and so on. Yeah, there's evil in the AI Act that should be in the criminal codes, not in the AI Act on liabilities and God knows what else. So I liked your part, but then unexpected as you are, what do you want to prohibit? Spyware, I fully agree, but also data brokers, facial recognition, but you're not so far going as I hoped, and cryptocurrency. Now I'm surrounded by people with cryptocurrency in their pockets, and they will not like what you read. So it's an unexpected book, and I would just recommend sell your cryptocurrencies to me, for instance, because I like them. But then also the part on transparency, third solution, strong, strong, strong. And the whole issue of deepfakes is that pops up there again. It is going to be very intransparent if we don't do anything about this. This data that is fake, that is composed, that is synthetic, as we call it. And there's a lot at loss. Our trust in images and so on must be gone. And I'm at the verge of withdrawing from universities because is a PhD written by the person? These fundamental things should be very much the center of our attention. I don't like the word transparency. There's a bigger idea behind, but you have all those big ideas. And then procurement and leading by examples. I have read that 3,000 times, but since you're so much in the policymaking world, your plea is more convincing because you add to that a lot of concrete examples of how that should work, and also what you do often is finding useful precedents that should encourage us to be more courageous in all these ideas. There are precedents in all these wild ideas, and you're a specialist in giving us the push to look back, to identify where we have been courageous and to do it over again. Yeah? So that is helping me a lot. Creating expertise. So I'm more anti-governmentalist than you, and that has to do with this business. The people in law and tech, and you described that wonderfully in the 90s and so on. There was an anarchistic feel that is not illegitimate and that we shouldn't throw away, but has been captured by capitalism. That I agree. And then there's the European take. You think, I don't necessarily, that the state is an actor of moral progress. That's a typical European thought. We have that. And I should have that. So I will work on it. I will do my best. I will work on it. The state as an object of moral progress. Okay. So that in that way you're interesting for me, and you've always been interesting. I like European liberals because they are European, which is state as a moral agent that we should. And then they pretend to be liberal. And it's the difference between 65% taxes on income or 64. But it's a symbolic difference. I like it. So I've been always following your league with more attention because you're actually in a sense, yeah, a good another Europe that we have lost. So, okay, state has moral progress, and you will build up expertise. Yeah, and that means that the state should make its own spyware, but then without licenses that are protected by trade secrets and so on. I know. So there's going to be much better spyware, and and I immediately understand the difference between Chinese use of it and European use. But you're right. I shouldn't make jokes about it. No, I shouldn't. But so all this is, we should go to more expertise. That we are only, that our civil servants are still using WhatsApp, ridiculous. And it took us 20 years. And so the privacy community has benefited from Trump and all the European aversion of it, because finally some messages are getting across. A European cloud, we've always wanted that. We wrote it 20 years ago, and now finally people start to think about it. And you have reminded us that we were so clumsy that when we proposed, the Germans are clumsy too. They propose a European cloud and they ask Microsoft and so on to help. And luckily this book reminds us that that is not the right approach. But I like these details because it's the mirror we need in Europe to wake up. And the passages on accountability, everybody says that, accountability, yes, but what you say about it matters. It's concrete, it goes back to, and it gives the leverage tools that we need to see what we have done. So I really appreciated those. So what we've done in one of those European laws, we only address the platforms as, and that you single out as a good mechanism, identifying the actors that count. Yeah? So if you want to regulate platforms, you name them. And there's nothing wrong with that granularity if you want to address accountability issues, because somebody has to render account, and in the case of the platforms, they're listed by Europe. It's clear it's not a small SME or it's not these kind of things. So that platform movement that CPDP has been witnessing and is very useful. And there's more. You even go as far as propose a new kind of court for cybersecurity issues. And then democracy should join. A very important message. We cannot do this alone, and that's why you like the Internet Declaration of the Future of the Internet Declaration that much, with many states signing it. So don't wait for criticism. There is none coming, and even the last solution where you advocate more public participation and so on. It's new. It's not dull. It's worth it. So yes, important book. Many good ideas, many intuitive ideas about, we have precedents that could be picked up by scholars that want to develop those ideas in all directions. So it is, you should become a research program leader of a good university. So what were my thoughts? There was hope in this book. And we thank you for that. We need hope. We need perspective. And partly it's in the solutions, but also it's in the tone and your DNA. We like your DNA. So, and the book still reads as it was published yesterday. So all the questions of today are already addressed in it. The deregulation initiative of the European Union, what are we doing? Read the book. It was anticipated. The big fight about the narratives, the framing as a separate chapter. This is the fight today at CPDP. The framing and so all that. And then what Mireille did 2 days ago, Mireille Hildebrandt with the opening session, trying to capture this worldview of those tech billionaires. You don't really go into that, but you insist, for instance, on the non-democratic, even anti-democratic nature of many of those tech billionaires and so on. So it's very complete. I kind of liked that a lot. What I missed was the broader analysis of technocracy, and that would have helped to show that we're all implied in this. Many of us believe in technology. Many of us, in a common sense thing, turn to it, and many of us are on Facebook. I'm not, for instance. Yeah, but but understand that the evil is also within us, and the ambiguities of Europe have to do, and you stress that. And then the image of our states as an actor of moral progress. There are many pages on how clumsy our European states are doing, and how much they depend already on these big tech companies, and it's all there. The facts are well chosen, and you're exploring the American mind being connected to Stanford and so on, has brought the two continents together. There's a lot of history writing, recent history writing in it that I appreciate, coupled with the vision. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This was great, except when you said, you know my DNA, and that really got me a bit scared. No, I'm just kidding. But I wanted to pick up on two things that I think are really critical in the points that you make. One is about the role of the state, which, of course, you're absolutely right to challenge the notion that states are acting in the public interest, and beyond that, who decides what is right. This is the subject of politics every day. When I hear discussions about we need a human in the loop in the context of AI, I always wonder, what human? Who do they represent? How can you have a human on behalf of all humans? It's not democratic. What is going on here? And so I agree with you that we shouldn't just blindly trust states to do the right thing. In fact, we must be suspicious at all times of the abuse of power, whether it's coming from market actors or public actors. But what I did want to try to bring across in the book are two things. One, and this also relates back to your question about borders, is to really put on the table the notion of legitimacy. So who has the mandate to act? And even if states do things that are incredibly stupid from time to time, they do so on a public mandate where there are also mechanisms of, checks and balances, oversight. We at least know what to do when we see a politician making a big mistake. We hold them to account, and we have all kinds of pathways there. And of course, this is not the case with the tech companies. And so that's a contrast I was hoping to lay out there, because I want, and this was also in my reflection to Esther and a sort of appeal to everyone, we must be empowered. Democratic actors must be empowered. And the criticism is correct, but also speaking from personal experience, I recall moments where I was viciously attacked by the civil society organizations that I most closely felt aligned with for destroying the internet or something quite grandiose like that. There's, I think, a thinning, a fracturing legitimacy of the core of what democratic governments are and have to do, and I just want that sort of, broad, legitimate and important mandate that representatives in our democratic societies have to matter. Secondly, and I think maybe I did not do this well enough in the book, is that for some people notions of democracy and the rule of law are not exactly the same things, but what I mean to say is that through rule of law based barriers or rules, checks and balances, state behavior is also kept in check. And one of the recommendations in the solutions part, for example, is what I'll talk about two things. One is what I call the public accountability extension. Because one of the concerns that I have is that governments use technology to offload accountability. So that police services can say, well, we don't hack suspects' phones. No, okay, great, because you're hiring a company that does it for you, okay? And what I'm proposing is that should no longer be allowed. Or that if Ursula von der Leyen uses WhatsApp, that she cannot say freedom of information laws don't apply because it's WhatsApp, or as the Dutch Prime Minister once said, I have a Nokia such and such and it only fits 30 messages. So, sorry, no public track record, and I'm not kidding. And this, of course, says more about the Prime Minister than about the technology, but the dynamics of sort of offloading accountability on the part of governments is a real problem that I also want to curb, but I think it's facilitated by the kinds of technologies that also exist out there without oversight, and that's the kind of dynamic that I want to break. And then the last one is, and it also has to do with encouraging more moral leadership, I guess, on the part of democratic states, is that a lot of the measures that we've seen have been very economically focused. You cannot abuse your market position to kill competitors. Okay, that's very valid. But what if we have companies, big or small, that actually hurt democracy? There are really not so many rules directly aimed at protecting the rule of law as such. And so, therefore, I try to identify a new category, indeed using existing phenomena in policy, but applying them in new contexts. That's what I try to do, indeed, to say, this is not reinventing the wheel, it has been done and you can do it in a different context, namely of tech again, is to say in competition and antitrust, we know the notion of significant market power. This is a sort of yardstick to say, are these companies now so big that they are so powerful that they should be subject to additional responsibilities? But to take that concept and say, what about significant societal power? So we look at tech companies and ask ourselves, is their impact on society of such nature that they should be subject to a greater scrutiny, responsibility, and oversight? Anyway, but thank you very much for your deep but entertaining comments. And thank you for being here, despite this being against your wishes, as we understood. I also didn't know how somewhat awkward it would be to be evaluated in a live session, but it's been mostly incredibly enjoyable. So I really appreciate your reflections. And now over to the audience, I think.
So, all right, so we have room for questions. Yes, okay. You have,
I was gonna ask a smart question, but I think a dumb one got ahead, and it's gonna be the dumb one. But what do you see as the risks of, because I understand how Trump, as this not Trump himself, but this lunacy happening across the Atlantic might help with the narrative in a sort of way of Europe from now to the future fighting against the status quo, as if the status quo wasn't also built by it. So I understand that it helps with we need to build new legislation and different and is it in this sort of 21st century secularism movement against tech companies? They're the gods, they're the algorithm, and there's this new separation, state and religion in some sort of way. The question is, what do you see as the risks today of Europe not understanding how, because the tone, sometimes I've been hearing a lot here and then, about how Europe always tried to fight with its legislative power all around against tech power, and it just didn't do as such, or didn't change the status quo because it couldn't. It didn't have enough. The market was against it, and so in the market as the US, this builder of the status quo. But then this narrative is very easy because Trump is very easy to be contrary to, and to not acknowledge how you yourself, I mean you as a I'm non-European, that's why I'm using you. You built you had your hand in building the status quo as it is, that you're now fighting against. So the question is, how do you see the risk of this narrative being tilted, and I am now the quote-unquote savior in some sort of way?
I propose we take a couple of questions first. You and then.
Thank you. Christian Ramsfeld from the OECD. Thank you very much for the panel presentation and discussion. The first observation, if I may quickly make, it seems to me that the issues that we discussed here are not specific to Europe, but are probably also shared by, including citizens within the United States. I just wanted to see if you would agree with that. But the question that I have is, if those tech companies are essentially as powerful, and you named the market value and how it compares to the GDP of France, shouldn't we expect or eventually even demand that they are governed by the same principles that countries abide to, meaning, for instance, that they are governed by democratic principles, that, for instance, they are directly affected by constitutions, and also that something like the division of power principle applies to them. And I was wondering to what extent you're exploring those thoughts in your book. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ike Soysal. I come also from Tilburg University. Thank for this panel. My question also comment is after this book got published. I'm also from Istanbul, and there was a civil coup in Turkey, and they basically Erdogan arrested his biggest candidates, and then Elon Musk basically banned his banned his Twitter account. And based on this, most of the Turkish citizens couldn't be able to access to this kind of accounts due to, we would be banned in Turkey, so we did it kind of approach. And I got the chance to represent Google, Twitter, YouTube back in the day in Turkey as a lawyer. And 5 or 8 years ago, this was more like, okay, we are taking the approach of ECHR. This is against the freedom of expression, therefore we are not going to go with the access ban decisions. They were like taking this approach, but currently they are more taking the approach of geopoliticism and Donald Trump, whatever Donald Trump says, they kind of, because Donald Trump openly supported Erdogan in his actions.
May I ask you to keep it a little bit shorter?
Yeah. Just, okay.
Theme,
so, like the questions, what could be done about that? And also for the raising digital awareness of the people to get their power back. There is the problem of attention economy, and they are overstimulating us with all this content. And therefore people get overstimulated, and their feelings getting numbed, and they cannot go protest for them, like expressing their democratic rights. And what can we do about that? My question.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Oh yeah, thank you. So my question is to Marietje. So Marietje, your book is a product of long-lasting trends, and then it's kind of telling what it is today. And I was curious because yesterday Elon Musk said that he would pull back from political campaigning in the midterms. So how do you assess, new developments in this subject? Also the failure of Deutsche, basically, this department. So how do you update your theory, or how do you assess these new developments? Do you think this trend is ongoing, or is it also possible that this is there is a reverse wave of this sort of trends? Thank you.
Hello? Okay. I would also love more voices than just mine, but it's true that the EU has, to a great extent, contributed to where we are today. I write about that. I think the book is a criticism of Silicon Valley in broad strokes, but also of democratic leaders for having allowed this situation to happen. The Trump phenomenon happened, or his second term happened after the book, so it doesn't directly speak to those issues. But I do think that for those of us who believe that Europe in many ways may be our last hope of seeing a significant market combined with respect for the rule of law, doing something. And I hear a lot of Americans also asking, please use your power here. We see you as our last hope. We're in a steady decline of democracy around the world over the past 20 years, which coincides with the rapid growth of the role that technology plays in our world. And I think it's been under-researched what the correlation is, but subtopics like overstimulation or disinformation in elections or what have you are, of course, pointers here. So when you listen to me, I'm actually not purely an academic. You probably hear that I'm much more of a sort of, policy person. I try to shed light on where we could go, and I'm also happy to say where I think we should go. So it's not only assessing what is there, but really what needs to change. And for that, sometimes you need to bring people along in what you want the world to look like. But of course, that doesn't mean I don't see, the lack of perfect commitment to our own promise of respecting people's rights. I mean, we have Trumpism in our midst. We are treating asylum seekers in inhumane ways. We are not standing up for the protection of people in Gaza. In fact, this is all happening in our name. So I have a lot of criticism of the status quo, but what I think we must do now is to use this momentum to empower the best of the EU to meet this moment of abuse of power, growing power grab by tech companies at the expense of our fundamental rights, our rule of law, and our freedoms. Now, do I also believe that Americans can participate? Sure. Again, this book was written before Trump got into office again, and actually it sort of leans on America to play its role, because there was a nascent movement of more guardrails around the use of technology, particularly in light of AI, for example, but of course that has been put through the shredder on day one. And I've been worried and disappointed at the lack of public outcry of some of the worst things that are happening in the United States. And when I talk to friends and colleagues, a lot of them express that they're fearful. But then I try to think back to people like Maria Ressa, who, despite decades of prison time hanging over her head, would go back to the Philippines to stand her ground, and always says we need to hold the line, and who believes that every inch that you give, you'll never get back. And I think Americans need to do more to hold the line, and I don't want to disregard how scared they are, but if they're scared now, imagine what 3.5 more years of this will lead to. And so this is problematic. Then how can we make citizens feel empowered again, which of course I think we must appreciate, if you're really talking about fear, the different context that is there in Turkey. And here too, we see the risk of this moment in a different way, right? Geopolitics is the name of the game. I'm sure that Erdogan thought he could get away with it now because people need Turkey in NATO, or the Western democracies need Turkey in the context of NATO. He made a sort of grand gesture in relation to Ukraine, saying that there might be Turkish troops there. He's a Machiavelli, and he understands this very well. And it's, again, a failure of the EU not to step up more in light of this absolutely gross violation of any, rule of law and any accession criteria and what have you. And so I'm hesitant to say how Turkish citizens, for example, should feel empowered, because the consequences for people who have not even really done anything but raise their voice, I'm thinking about Osman Kavala, for example, are sitting in prison. Those are real risks for what happens after speaking out. And so all I can hope is that between American citizens who don't want what's happening, European citizens who don't want what's happening, Turkish citizens, and the world over, we can find new solidarity and sort of new focus in a movement, because there are going to be fewer people who care about democracy and the rule of law, unfortunately, if you look at the trends. More threats, even in our midst, but also globally. And so those of us who care need to be more strategic, more deliberate, and with fewer resources, because also civil society is under pressure and academia is under pressure. So it's, a cluster of problems. Sorry, your last question?
Okay, so it was about your book is a product of like last decade's trends.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what we've been witnessing with Trump's kind of alignment with big tech, owners or like the patrons. It's a new reality and paradigm, and every day we see something new. And then yesterday, I think it was Elon Musk said that he says he'll pull back on political spending in upcoming midterms, for example. So, like, how do you assess these new developments in your theory, and then how do you see if it would trigger a reverse wave? So
yeah, thank you. Sorry, just too many questions. And my head was in Turkey, and so that seemed a little bit far away. So I think the thesis of the book stands without Musk, without Trump. And I think it's really important to remember, because for a lot of people it made it very visible with Musk, and so it would be easy to understand that if he stops doing what he's doing, then we're done with the problem. But we're not. If only, you know. And so I don't think it fundamentally changes the situation. I do think what the Musk effect has been is that people are aware now of what the problem is. It's sort of undeniable in many ways. But the risk is that only the visible gets understood and the invisible does not get understood. And if you want to sort of summarize the book, I think what my book does is show the invisible. Shows us how we got to Musk as sort of the ultimate next step that would almost be inevitable, because if these companies continue to assert themselves further and further and further, then inevitably they're also using their power to influence politics through funding, which is possible in the United States in ways that thankfully we don't want here in Europe. But it's tricky. And the other thing is, Paul mentioned also how I have a chapter about framing, because I think it's incredibly important to understand how power plays work in relation to framing our understanding of things, including technology. What Trump is a master of is doing something quite outrageous, saying that immigrants eat pets, for example, which, you know, truly out there. Then if 2 weeks later he says, maybe they don't eat pets, but they're crazy anyway, and then, you know, we just have to make sure that they get deported en masse, then that concept of deporting sounds much less crazy after having thought about eating pets, you know? So saying extreme things actually normalize a whole bunch of other things in the ears of the broader population, sort of below the threshold of the absolutely crazy. And so it's a tactic to stretch the room for doing outrageous things by first pretending that the goalposts are at extremes of the spectrum, so that what can be tolerated within that grows. And I think that's the risk of what is happening with Musk. We've seen Musk and people may think, well, that was a crazy phenomenon, and so now that he's gone, phew, we can breathe. But actually, if Musk had not been there, a whole bunch of things that are happening now in the United States would be seen as completely unacceptable and the extreme in otherwise. And so the risk is that we get numbed and that we think, okay, well, the biggest danger is now perhaps, you know, who knows what the world looks like tomorrow, but for now, maybe less dangerous. But unfortunately, I don't think it solves the major problems. I really wish it did.
All right, so I think we have only a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask our two discussants if you would like to add something with like 1 or 2 lines. No? No, Paul? No? No?
Read the book.
Yes, okay, yeah, that's a good point. So join me, everyone, in thanking our discussants and, of course, our author. So thank you also for the questions and being here.